Hey, what's up? What's up? Uh, Here we go. My daughter back there wants to say hi to the world. Say hi, world. Yeah, okay, there is your 15 seconds of fame, sweetheart. Go ahead and scoot and close the door on your way out, sweetie, okay? Bye. Today we're going to be looking at supranationalism. We're still in Unit 4, Political Geography. And so, looking at what we did last week, we talked about sovereignty. And I say last week, I mean not the last time we talked, which was actually before Christmas break. So when we look at, actually, here's what I want to do before I do anything else. Oh my gosh, I want to make sure I got my presentation showing here. So I realized I got just a smidge ahead of myself. Let me make sure I don't want to have that problem that we had a few times ago where I never actually shared the screen with you guys. So we're gonna do that. So okay, looking at this sovereignty, last week we talked a little bit about that. And so we'll get back to that in a second. And so when we look at sovereignty, we're looking at the ability, the strength and ability of a country to be able to govern whatever happens within its borders. Okay, when I say govern whatever's happening, what I mean is they're going to be able to call the shots without having to answer to any other kind of a country. All right. If the United States has true sovereignty within our borders, we're not answering to Canada or Mexico necessarily about the way we do things, or anyone else in the world for that matter. So that's kind of what we looked at today. We're going to revisit that towards the end of this discussion, because one of the big criticisms of supranationalism is the idea that it puts our very definition of sovereignty into question. All right. We're going to figure out why as we go. A few things I wanted to do. Last time we talked, I put up my social media contact information. There it is again. I'm on Twitter. I'm on YouTube. I've got a Human Geography Facebook page. The more you guys use those sources, the more I would use them with you as well. YouTube is the one that I'm just inherently the most active on. So if you ever have any questions or need to contact me or anything, Twitter is good. YouTube, put a question in the comments of some of the videos I've created. I'll get back with you on those things. Just wanted to make sure you guys know that I am able to be contacted. Another thing that I wanted to show you guys is when you're looking at YouTube and you're looking for sources that do a really good job at showing political geography in AP Human Geography, I love PBS NewsHour for my news. They always have a segment in there about that has something to do with culture or something or economics. It's always a really cool source. You can see geography in all over the place whenever you're watching the news in general, but that's a really good source. Okay, let's get to it. We were looking at supranational, or you can't talk about supranationalism without kind of revisiting sovereignty. The power of a country to rule itself without interference from the outside. Historically, this has been defined, as we talked about in December, by the military power to defend one's borders. And I showed y'all a map last time about the Roman Empire, and you've got the frontier zone towards the northern part of the empire that they just couldn't defend past a certain point. And so that was the definition of their borders, it was measured by their ability to defend it militarily. Now, on top of that, when you're studying European history, one of the things that kind of characterize, I would say, everything from the Middle Ages up to modern times, more or less, definitely the 1900s, you've got this concept of the balance of power, all right? Europe didn't like it. As a whole, they didn't like it collectively whenever one single country gained so much strength and power that they were able to dominate other countries or all other countries. The reasons that they didn't like this boils down to, well, you can definitely see it surmised in Napoleon and Hitler, okay? Napoleon started a conquest of Europe. Everyone, in some form or fashion in Europe, every European country either were allies with Napoleon, either were conquered and their kingdoms deposed by Napoleon, such as Spain, or they were forced allies or in some kind of forced allegiance to Napoleon, like Austria and Russia. All right. So everyone in Europe, except for the United Kingdom, except for Great Britain, were under the control of Napoleon in the early 1800s. That's what happens when the balance of power goes totally wrong and there is no balance of power. So again and again throughout history, you see where Europe tries to maintain this at any and all cost. Hitler was another example. Hitler started to take lands in order to have more living space. Lebensraum is the German word for that. And so in order to combat powerful foes, countries would oftentimes form coalitions and alliances. So again, looking at Europe, if it looked like any one single country like France or Napoleon was going to get so strong that they would control that balance, or that they would single-handedly control all of Europe, then the other countries would form coalitions, basically alliances against them. All right, and so it didn't matter if the allied countries were culturally or politically the same. What I mean by this is if you look at the 30 Years' War, which actually happened prior to Napoleon, this was in the 1600s. You've got a war where it lasted 30 years. So I mean the motivations for the war change over time, but initially it was all about religion, kind of on a local level within Germany. Okay, but eventually the French, who were predominantly Catholic, ended up siding with Protestants in this dispute because it ended up being about politics and about that balance of power. And so they would rather help Protestants than to allow one single country to dominate in Europe and have that balance of power tilt in their favor. So that was the 30 Years' War example. Napoleonic Wars, once again, Austria, even though they were allies with Napoleon, even though Napoleon married the Austrian Archduchess, he still sided with the Allies against Napoleon once Napoleon started to fall after the Russian campaign. And yeah, another example is World War II. Stalin, we're going to talk about in a second. He didn't like the United States. He allied with us, the West, in order to stop Hitler, because we collectively disliked Hitler more than we disliked each other at the time. But things are going to change in the 1900s. All right. The League of Nations. Okay. So when I say things are going to change, the 1900s brought with it a lot of militarily, our technology from a military standpoint was insane, but also because of our increased interconnectedness with one another after, in particular, World War II, we're going to start seeing changes in the way that we handle our relationships with one another. All right. So in the beginning of the 1900s, you've got the Great War, World War I. One of the things that kind of came out of that war was the invention of the League of Nations. Now, Woodrow Wilson was our genius PhD president at the time, and he kind of came up with this idea, or this series of ideas called the 14 Points Plan, which is kind of the way that we went about handling peace after World War I. And the 14th point was to create a League of Nations. All right. And the purpose of this is to essentially promote world peace. I have it here somewhere. Preserving a permanent peace. Okay. We wanted to make sure, quite unlike we have ever been able to do historically, that another war of the magnitude of the Great War would never occur again. Now, the ultimate irony here is that the way that we ended World War I largely led to the Second Great War, World War II. But this is the purpose of the League of Nations. It is the first example of supranationalism that we're going to see in the world. And yeah, you could argue that even going back as far as the Greeks, they might have had supranationalism when you have like the Delian League, for example. Athens kind of headed up this allegiance of city-states in Greece in order to fight against the Persians. So you can argue that supranationalism maybe was a Greek thing, but if we're looking at the modern world or anything close to it, the League of Nations is the first supranational organization. Unfortunately, another irony having to do with this League of Nations is that even though it was created and proposed and presented by Woodrow Wilson. It was his big pet project. The United States never joined because he couldn't just unilaterally decide, hey, the U.S. is going to be part of the League of Nations, guys. I don't care if you don't like it, Congress. That's what we're going to do. No, it didn't work like that. And Congress actually was still very isolationist. The last thing we wanted to do was join an alliance, more or less, with the rest of the world that would require us to bend at the expense of other countries. And we didn't want to get ourselves involved in all of that. And so, once again, looking at that whole sovereignty mentality. So, so that's the issue with. I should have gone. I didn't go to the slide in time. That's the issue with the League of Nations. Even though maybe it was a good idea in concept, in practice, it really was a giant failure. The League of Nations really didn't have a whole lot of power. It would offer suggestions and ideas, but ultimately countries had to come together and agree that they were going to abide by those things. And eventually, prior to World War II, Germany, Japan, they back out of the League of Nations, and we find ourselves once again at exactly where we were prior to, and that is trying to figure out how we're going to win this gigantic modern war. All right, so after World War II, you've got more changes, okay? The biggest single change that's going to kind of lead to, immediate supranationalism is going to be nuclear bombs, all right? This is a bigger game changer than all the military weapons and industrial weapons and things that occurred prior to World War I, because this here is what really ended World War II. The United States was the only country that had the ability to use nuclear bombs. No one else had it. Other countries may have been working on the development of them at the time, but when we started dropping bombs on Japan, we were the only ones without power. That automatically puts us at a position that no one else in the world had ever seen at that point and was able to see at that point. We were the world's superpower and literally the only one. All right. Balance of power ceased to exist during this period, and the United States kind of just was what we were. Okay. Another thing about this that was kind of a big deal was this concept of globalization. Now, in human geography, I'm sure you've already talked about globalization. At this point, you've talked about globalization. And when we talk about it, I might have mentioned it a few sessions ago too in culture. The way that I always present this to my student is that there's three different types of globalization. And one is going to be cultural globalization. Economic globalization is probably the one that we are going to spend the most time looking at. And the third is this idea of political globalization. No matter how you slice it, globalization is a major game changer. It's going to be a huge reason why we look at supranationalism. The other thing is going to be the Cold War, which is a battle of ideologies. So when we talk about ideology, we're looking at, you might have heard people talk about the left or the right, the liberal left versus the conservative right. In the United States, it might be the leftist, the Democrats, and the conservative far right Republicans. I want to show you something about that in just a second. But here's the bottom line is this. The United States, we represent democracy, very, very liberal form of government. We like the idea of preserving the rights of people, giving people a say in their government. The Soviets, they weren't any of that, okay? They were commies everywhere. Oh, my gosh. And so we were at odds ideologically. And so once we defeated Germany and Japan, World War II was over with, there were issues on how we were going to handle reparations. But when the Soviets wanted to do their thing, we wanted to do our thing. And when I say we, it was more than just the United States and the West. In other words, the U.S., Great Britain, France, we all kind of saw eye to eye. The Soviets were like, no, we're not going to let you guys democratize everyone. We're going to also get in on this. And by the way, we want to establish communism. All right. So when we look at ideology, the United States and Soviet Union were allies during World War II. because we hated Hitler collectively. Hitler was taking land from all over Europe and doing things really bad right then and there. So we wanted to fix him. And sometimes the enemy of your enemy is, or however that saying goes, So we had that one thing in common with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union, and that was defeat Hitler. But if you look at this here is, I've heard it called a ideological matrix. Sometimes you might see ideologies represented on a timeline, but this right here is really a better way to understand what it is that we're really looking at here. Okay, let me show you. Bam. And by the way, this website is where this this chart comes from. It is actually a ideological quiz. You can go in here and type this in and figure out ideologically where on this chart you would be. It is a good way to figure out just maybe how Democrat or Republican you are. But here's the thing that you need to know is that this right here, as far up on the authoritarian as you can get, and as far left on the economics, that's Joseph Stalin. Over here, as far authoritarian as you can get, and as far right economically is going to be Hitler. That's the difference between those two. Here's the thing that we think about mostly when we think about these two leaders, and that is they are authoritarian. So what do I mean by that? When I talk about authoritarian, we're talking about someone that is a dictator. They control with an iron fist. They don't take no crap. And people have very, very little say in what's going to go on in government. The opposite of the authoritarian on this chart is going to be your libertarian. And what the further down that list you get towards libertarian, the more you just don't care about what people are going to do. Okay. So you might think in the United States, a very conservative, or maybe someone that might be up here might say stuff like, we don't want gay marriage. We don't want to legalize weed. People down here are like, oh, you can marry whoever you want to and smoke whatever you want, and we don't care as long as you're not causing a riot. All right. So that's kind of the difference between your authoritarian and your libertarian. When you look at the economic left, this is going to be your communism on the far left, meaning that everyone is a worker of the state. In other words, the state owns everything. People are going to be workers for the state. So everyone collectively shares in all of that. This is where the Soviets felt like everyone's going to be a worker. It doesn't really matter who you are. You work for the state, and the state owns everything collectively. Over here, the Nazis under Hitler, they didn't feel like that at all. On the far conservative right, they are nationalists. Okay, here's kind of the controversy. Whenever Donald Trump the other day said that he was a nationalist. All right, now he didn't mean he's a Nazi. That's how it might be interpreted. But what he meant, or what the Nazis would mean, or what you think about a nationalist in the Nazi sense, is they mean that Germans are better than other ethnic groups and therefore should control everything having to do with the economy. So when you're looking at far right nationalism economically, that means that there is one group that has all the power and control. And if you're not part of that group, you shouldn't have any of the power and control. That's kind of the difference here. Okay. So everyone in the United States, everyone in the US is going to be right here in this little black circle. All right. So when we think about someone like Donald Trump, he's going to probably be right here. Someone like President Obama is going to probably be somewhere like right here. Okay. Bernie Sanders might be slightly a little bit further left or whatever, but I mean, for the most part, this is America. We don't have, I'm not saying that we don't have crazies. We don't have a Nazi party in Congress. We don't have commies in Congress or any of that stuff. Okay, so that's the thing that I want you guys to know right off the bat, is that this here is where we're going to be. This is where Stalin was. This is where Hitler was. Okay, so the Cold War was a competition between the United States and the Soviets over who would impose what system where. Immediately after World War II, the United States and the USSR competed over reparations. This right here is Germany. It was divided between the West. In other words, the United States and their allies get Western Germany and can democratize it and make it however they want. And East Germany went to the Soviets, as well as all these Eastern countries that were going to be known as your satellite countries under the control of the Soviets. Now, this is Berlin. which is the capital of Germany, it was kind of like on a miniature scale, split between West that was controlled by, the West, and the East, which was controlled by Soviets. Now, I put this here as well because I want you to know this word enclave. West Berlin was an enclave. In other words, it was completely surrounded by essentially another country. Okay, so you can consider that to be an ethnic enclave. It caused a lot of problems too, because there was at one point where the Soviets actually blockaded that Western Berlin and prevented the United States and their allies from getting the food and aid that those people needed, because they were trying to pressure the West into giving it up. Churchill called the containment of the Soviet of Soviet communism, he called it the Iron Curtain. And this right here would represent your Iron Curtain. It was like a geographic area that represented the extent of where communism was at that time. And that's exactly where they wanted to keep it in the West. No more communist expansion. That's what we mean by Iron Curtain. Let's prevent them from spreading the system where the policy became known as containment, which I don't think I've got in my slide, but I would definitely take the time to write that down. All right. So that right there is a map of how the I guess alliances started to kind of take hold. Notice you've got three main colors here. You've got blue, you got red, and you got green. All right. So quick lesson. When you hear people talk about the third world, what are they talking about? Well, that is kind of like today's way of referring to LDCs, or your developing countries. Usually you talk about the third world, people are talking about Africa. Okay, yeah, you might have others that might be considered that, maybe South Asia or some of these countries, but usually you talk about third world, you're talking about your poorest of the poor countries. But that is not actually what the word means. Okay, what you're looking at here is the first, the second, what the heck is that? And the third world. Listen carefully. The blue, headed up by the United States, is the first world. Hashtag first world problems. It doesn't mean developed countries. It simply means those that allied with the West during the Cold War. The red is the second world. Hashtag you never hear about second world countries, do you? That's because there is no second world anymore. It fell with the Soviet Union. So the second world was going to be the communist states that were under the sphere of influence of the Soviets and the Chinese. You got a few others there in there. There's Cuba, okay? But this is your Iron Curtain. Notice the green countries here. Notice the green countries. The reason why they were part of the third world and they weren't part of the first and the second is because at the time, a lot of these countries were new countries that had just gotten out of colonialism. They were being controlled by the first and the second worlds. And another reason for this is because they are very, very poor. And in terms of globalization and picking sides in the I guess the near hot war, proxy wars that were going on between the Soviets and the U.S., these guys didn't really have a whole lot of say. So they were the ones that we were trying to protect from being communist, and they're the ones that the Soviets were trying to prevent from being democracy. So if you look over here, Afghanistan, Vietnam, according to this map, is actually part of the second world, and Korea. These are all some of the biggest places where we fought against, and here they are listed out, some of the places we fought against the Soviets through proxy wars. And when I talk about proxy war, it's kind of like what's going on in Syria right now. We're not actually on the ground fighting against the Soviets during these altercations, but we're funding people in Vietnam to fight against Soviets in Vietnam. We're funding South Korea to fight against North Korea. We're trying to overthrow Cuba. We're trying to help the Afghanis to liberate themselves from Soviet expansion. Okay. So at this point, because of the sheer military might of the United States and the USSR, countries sided with one or the other based on their ideology. And in other cases, both sides would go in and openly try to control countries in order to bring them to one side over the other. Okay, so the West, meaning Europe and the USA, were on one side, and the USSR, China, Yugoslavia, Cuba, and other satellite states and other communists were on the other side. And that brings us back to what we're looking at with supranationalism. Yes, I did just go a long time in the Cold War. You need to know all that stuff because it kind of leads into, in particular, this very issue, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. All right, so the people that allied, or the countries that allied with the West during the Cold War, they were NATO. And NATO is still very much a thing today. You can go, I think I've got a map for you. There's NATO. Notice that some of these Eastern European countries that were satellite countries under Soviet control are actually now part of NATO as well. Russia was super butthurt about that. I'm not even going to lie. They didn't like that one bit when the Czech Republic and some of these other countries, the second the Soviet Union falls, they start to join NATO and align more so with the West. You still see these issues between Russia and the West today. So is Russia part of Europe geographically? Russia is kind of part of Europe and part of Asia, but politically, usually if you talk about Europe and the West, you're not lumping Russia into that because they are ideologically quite different. Going back up here for a second, the Warsaw Pact, these are the countries that aligned themselves with the Soviets, okay? And that's what it looks like. This is the Warsaw Pact and NATO going into, I guess these light blue ones are going to be NATO as far as 1982. But notice that the Warsaw Pact are these that established where the Iron Curtain is, more or less. Okay, Warsaw Pact does not exist anymore. It fell and broke down with the fall of the Soviet Union. Let's see, what do I have here? Okay, so that's really all I'm going to talk about with the Cold War and the aftermath of that. One thing I do want you guys to know, though, about NATO is that it was and probably is predominantly a military alliance or a military based supranational organization. It emerged quite literally to combat and to counteract this alliance here that existed between Soviets and their allies. So that's what NATO and the Warsaw Pact was. And the follow-up, I guess, if you would say the ancestor to the League of Nations is going to be the United Nations. Now, believe it or not, I couldn't find a map that showed every single country that in a very clear way. You probably look at your textbook. I'm almost certain that you're going to find a map. Bottom line is the vast majority of countries are going to be part of the United Nations. There are 193 members of the United Nations, and two they're not full out members, but they are observers. I don't know if that's the right word, but they are observers within the United Nations, and that is Palestine and Vatican City. So neither one of those get votes, for example, like in the Security Council or in the General Assembly, but they do have a say in discussions and things like this that take place internationally. Here is the bottom line. The purpose of the United Nations, I'm going to read it to you real quick. The UN came into being in 1945 following the devastation of the Second World War with one central mission. And by the way, this comes right from the UN website. The maintenance of international peace and security. Hey, that sounds just kind of like the League of Nations, right? The UN does this by working to prevent conflict, helping parties in conflict make peace, peacekeeping, and creating the conditions to allow peace to hold and flourish. All right, so that's your bottom line. Here are some other things that are on that very same webpage. They want to protect human rights. You don't want another Holocaust to happen, okay? Deliver humanitarian aid. You don't want people right now. I want to say that I heard the other day they're considering the issue with starving children in Yemen to be one of the biggest humanitarian crises in modern times. I can't remember exactly the verbiage they used for that, but we're talking tons of kids as young. My daughter, you just now met, was 6 years old. You got kids like that laying out, weighing 15 pounds, starving to death. Okay. Right now we're struggling to be able to get humanitarian aid to that war-torn area because it's war-torn. So those are some of the issues there that UN tries to help with. Promote sustainable development. You may not have heard very much about sustainable development unless you have an outstanding teacher that's already brought that into the discussion. For me, I may have talked a little bit about this. I get into sustainability a lot in agriculture, and also when we start looking at development leading into urban geography. But when we talk about something being sustainable, it quite literally means, like the word is, something that can be sustained over time without wrecking the world we live in. Fossil fuels is not an example of sustainable development. Finding alternatives to that, finding alternatives to our way of throwing plastic waste into the ocean, things like this. These are all things we talk about when we talk about trying to promote sustainable development. We're trying to undo those things and make our environment sustainable for future growth, so that our generations ahead of us don't have to pick up the pieces of our mess like they're going to have to do with climate change. And also uphold international law. These are the things that the UN tries to do. The United Nations is split up into these different areas. You've got the General Assembly, which is almost like a giant Congress meeting consisting of representatives from the different member states. All right, so there would be 193 different representatives at least within the General Assembly. The Security Council is very, very important. I would take the time to write down these 5 permanent countries. At the end of this presentation, there is a video link that I'm going to make a big deal about when we get there. But I would recommend learning a little bit more about how these 5 permanent members, known as the P5, sometimes you hear them called P5, how they have, I guess, a lot of power within the United Nations, and which gives them a lot of power in helping to determine the policy of world politics. And notice also what's significant about these 5 countries: the United States, United Kingdom, all right, France, Russia, China. Well, they're the winners of World War II, right? That's why Germany's not on the list. Germany has, you've got the European Union we're going to talk about in a second, but Germany is the biggest single economy, the most influential state within the European Union. Why is France and Britain up there and Germany not? It's because they were Nazis. They got beat in World War II. And so now they're not part of the permanent members. So the thing that's so significant about this is whenever we get together as a group of countries in the UN and try to determine how we're going to help to do these things up here, how we're going to help to protect human rights and deliver humanitarian aid and so on and so forth, these countries here have a huge say in what that's going to look like. For example, Syria is a proxy war, more or less, in a lot of ways between Russia and the United States. All right, so if we have a way that we want to handle Syria and get that area to establish peace, and the Soviets, the Russians don't like it, Vladimir Putin says, heck no, we're not going to let that pass through the Security Council. We're going to veto it. You see, these 5 permanent members have veto power. So they can undo policy that might be voted on, or they can prevent a vote on how to establish policy that's going to prevent that's going to solve these problems. The United States does it as well. You got people building houses in Palestinian territory in just outside of Israel. The United States protects that by vetoing legislation that's created by the General Assembly or by the Security Council to undo those things. So you see every single one of these countries have used this veto power in some way, shape, or form. Some people say it forms checks and balances. Okay. Other people say it gives huge global powers to these particular 5 countries. Germany kind of wants to be a part of that. Will they ever get to be a part? Who knows? I guess it just depends on how they feel about adding permanent members. Why if one of these countries vetoes that? Well, I guess not. So I would say it doesn't look good for them. Economic and Social Council. This is another part of the UN. International Court of Justice, and then the Secretariat. When we talk about Secretariat, We're looking at the office that is kind of the administrative offices headed up by the Secretary General. The Secretary General used to be Ban Ki-moon, a Korean guy, and now is Antonio Guterres, who actually used to be the Prime Minister of Portugal, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so economic globalization was the other big thing. So we talked about there being, the military, the nuclear bombs, the new military alliances. We talked about kind of the Cold War, but the biggest driver of supranationalism in the world today, the biggest driver by a landslide, is going to be economic globalization. Okay, and this has to do largely with our interconnectedness. So you've got groups like the European Union that emerged for a series of different reasons. But the main thing that they're trying to do is create this region into more of a, where'd my cursor go? And my mouse is dialing. Wow. They will establish this region here as a single economic unit, not a series of different economic units like it was. So at Europe prior to the European Union would have been you would have had to there would have been migration laws or things from one country to another. The currencies would have had to be exchanged from one country to another, as you might have had francs in France and something else in another country. And you had to get those things converted over. And it was a big mess, and it stunted economic growth within Europe. So Europeans were thinking, well, hey, we can do several things here. One, we can kind of promote unity among ourselves. We can promote unity and not nationalism, promote unity by using maybe one currency, the euro. We can get rid of trade barriers and make migration between countries way more easy so that we don't have to worry about economics getting stunted between countries. So we can be more competitive with large trading countries like the United States. So this here was one of the answers to being able to compete more economically with the U.S. and just in general, everyone would benefit from being able to freely trade with one another. And so this here is kind of a big deal. The Eurozone, by the way, is not necessarily the exact same as the European Union, but if you hear the word Eurozone, we're talking about the area or the region within Europe where they use the euro as their single currency. Again, in order to promote unity and economics. NAFTA is another trade agreement, or another organization, I guess you will, that is centered on free trade. And this right here is the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement. It's on the news right now. If you paid any attention to Mr. Trump, he's talking about wanting to negotiate it. In fact, he has been renegotiating NAFTA, and according to an article that I read recently, this one here may be that same article or one like it. They actually have apparently signed a new agreement and waiting for it to be ratified. So you still see that in the news today. What it actually is, I guess I don't have a map. What the heck? Well, it's Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. That's it. That's what NAFTA is. North American Free Trade Agreement. What we're trying to do is promote each of our well-being equally by getting rid of regulations and things like that prevent certain types of work from being done in certain areas. But what Mr. Trump is trying to do is he feels like it's too one-sided towards Mexico. If you go way back to when NAFTA was a brand new thing in the early 1990s, about the time of President H.W. Bush was president, and he was running against Bill Clinton whenever Bill Clinton won. And you also have Ross Perot that was in there running as a Republican as well. What Perot really differed from George H.W. Bush on was whether or not NAFTA was good for our country, because people were afraid it was kind of too one-sided towards Mexico. And that's kind of what Trump is trying to do. The trade deficit right now between the U.S. and Mexico is big. He's trying to renegotiate. And that's the reason why he wants to change this. So plenty of information. I think I've got a video actually that you guys could look at about this. But one of the things that is a criticism is that in the United States, we feel like a lot of, or I guess a lot of people that are against it kind of feels like a lot of textile jobs or a lot of other factory work might have been moved from the United States into Mexico to capitalize on on cheaper labor. And then since there are tariffs and things were lifted, companies didn't have to pay tons of money to get those items re-imported to be sold into places like the United States and Canada. So they were able to capitalize on cheap labor, which put a lot of Americans out of manufacturing jobs. That's kind of the controversy here. Okay, so let me move on. All right, OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Petroleum is another word for crude oil, pretty much. So these are the controllers of the majority of the oil in the world. When I say that, what they actually do is they produce approximately 45% of all the oil being produced today, but they control, these countries that you see right here on this map, control about 84% of all proven oil reserves. And what that means is all the oil that we know about 84% of that we know about is going to be in the hands of these countries that are part of OPEC. So what do? Do they just control oil and do whatever they want to and reaping the benefits? Oh, there's a bigger version of the map. I will load it up for you guys. What they're trying to do, y'all, is they're trying to keep the price and the supply of oil stable. And they do this for economic reasons, really. See, a lot of these countries, like if you look at Venezuela, for example, if you look at the news on Venezuela, their economy is going to crap. They have huge inflation problems. Usually their gas is super cheap because they are they're an oil exporting country. Almost their entire economic well-being relies on oil. You've got other countries in Africa that are kind of in the same scenario. Saudi Arabia and some of these countries, their oil is just such a huge deal for these countries that in order, it really is the driving force of their economy. So let's say that Venezuela wants to make a quick buck. Well, what they could do is they could bring down the price of their oil substantially, way lower than all these others. And if they did, who's the world going to buy oil from? Well, they buy it from Venezuela. So what would the other oil-producing countries have to do in order to compete with Venezuela? Well, if you said that they would have to bring down their prices a lot, you're absolutely right. So this is the reason for OPEC. They're trying to set the price of oil in a way that keeps the price relatively high and the supply stable so that they can monitor and control the price of oil being sold and exported to the majority of the world. So I already said all this. So let's look at this. What would happen if one of them budged? I just gave you an example of Venezuela, but here's a real life example. You guys probably haven't been driving that long if you're driving at all. I started driving in 2000, all right? And by 2001, I was driving on my own and had my car. And I remember probably about 2002, 2003 thinking, oh my gosh, I can't even afford to go to my $6 an hour job at the deli because I can't afford gas. Gas was like $1.20. I was used to spending about 80 cents per gallon, okay? But what happens is in the late 2000s, around 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, some of that area, gas started to go up and it looked like it was never going to stop. I mean, I got to where I was paying $3.50 or almost $4 a gallon here in South Carolina for gas. And I was spending about $400 to $450 on gas, driving 50 miles a day to work as a teacher. So I was really forking out the dough here. But then something that nobody expected started to happen, and that is gas prices in about 2014, if I remember correctly, started to go down substantially to about where it is right now. I can go right down the road and get gas for about $1.70, about $1.75, $1.75. All right, so here's the thing. Why did gas go down so much? So the reason is we had oil reserve in the United States. We call it oil shale, and Canada also has oil reserves in these tar sand areas, and I believe it's the Alberta province. All right. So it was not economical for these countries to produce all this oil because the cost of extracting it was really expensive. But because of improved technology and because oil was so expensive from the OPEC countries, it became more economical for us to produce our own oil out of those areas. And so this right here is the oil shale areas, predominantly this region right here, where we start to extract oil and produce oil for ourselves. We also have a lot of natural gas and things like this. But the reason why gas went down is because the demand for it went down substantially in the United States. Even though we produce at this time a ton of oil, almost as much as Saudi Arabia, if I read correctly the other day, we still import the second largest amount in the world, just behind China, of oil. It's because we consume just a ton of energy here in the United States. So long story short, the demand for oil went down. Now, hybrid cars is another reason for this. Our fuel efficiency in our vehicles have caused us to use less gas for the same amount of driving, thus driving down demand. So if demand goes down a lot, OPEC countries have to amp up, either decide to increase prices or amp up that supply. And so when we stop relying as much on oil in the 2014, 2015, 2016, it kind of hit some of these countries a little bit hard. And so recently in 2016, they decided they're going to reduce supply in order to increase demand. And so gas started to go up again. And now here it is kind of going down again ever since about, September or October. And it's pretty low right now. So that's OPEC in a nutshell. And clear these other ones pretty quick. ASEAN, I call it ASEAN. I don't know if that's correct or not. I don't know how you would spell that as an acronym, but what it is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, established in 1967. It's 10 member states, not 12. And this right here is them. Notice that China is not part of this. Notice that Taiwan and Japan, your Asian tigers, Korea, they're not part of this. Okay, this is a different trade bloc of some of your poorer, less economically sound countries. In an effort to grow faster collectively, they teamed up. And if you look at this one area, then they would make up the second fastest growing economy in Asia at the moment. So that's one of the ways that they're working on trying to develop themselves is through working together, kind of like the European Union. The World Trade Organization, WTO, is a 164 member states, is a global trade a group that kind of helps to regulate global trade. And they do it kind of like the United Nations, is kind of a peace, kind of like preserving peace kind of supranational organization. What these guys try to do is handle different types of disputes in order to prevent things from getting spiraled out of control. Well, if we want to have a world that's centered on interconnectedness and globalization, one of the best ways to do this is to agree on kind of the rules of the trade. So members vote and agree on rules and regulations. They handle disputes and prevent things from spiraling out of control and resulting in wars. These guys are able to impose sanctions on groups if they break the rules and regulations. Some of the criticisms of the World Trade Organization are that it's too favorable towards developed countries, and it's hard to argue against that. I mean, if you're rich, then it's easy kind of to stay rich. If you're super poor, then it's harder to kind of get in a position of being super rich. That applies not only to countries in the world, but to people today in society. I mean, it's a lot easier for someone who is born in a rich family to be rich themselves. So it has to do with who is in control of resources and things like this. A lot of times the World Trade Organization catches a lot of flack for that. Another thing is that because of some of the infrastructure in places that are the poorest in the world, like a lot of your sub-Saharan African countries, a lot of the plans to solve some of the world's problems, or to solve trade or to improve trade with developing countries, doesn't really work. So that's part of that. The African Union is essentially every country in Africa is going to be part of this. here's a quick slide I found on the internet that kind of summarizes it a little bit. The purpose of the African Union is to help secure Africa's democracy, human rights, and sustainable economy. There's that economic emphasis there. The Southern Common Market, this group here is known as the Southern Common Market and consists of most of your Latin American or your South American countries. And so it's kind of like NAFTA and the European Union, but with your South American countries. And so there, this here is sometimes you'll see it called Mercosur. I don't know if that's an acronym or not, but again, like I said, the Southern Common Market is what you call this. Established by the Treaty of Asuncion in 1991. Its full members are those that you see there. The purpose is to, and I underlined it, promote free trade and fluid movement of goods, people, and currency. I read somewhere that these guys would like to have a single currency. I'm not sure if that's going to happen or not. And then here finally is kind of like a map that shows an outline of a lot of the supranational organizations that we just spent time talking about, as well as possibly a few others here that we didn't look at. So supranationalism is a kind of a big deal. It's kind of here to stay, like it or not. And in most cases, these, like I said earlier, are going to be economic blocs or economic trade organizations. They're focused on trying to promote the well-being of all member states rather than just going it alone in a world of globalization. Now, to wrap it up, what does this mean for sovereignty? Right? Supranational organizations have put sovereignty in the question. I live in South Carolina, so this is probably pretty common, but you drive through some of these podunk towns down here, you might see these signs that say, get the U.S. out of the UN. You still see people say that, supranationalism for us is bad because it forces us to care and to kind of put ourselves into the politics of other parts of the world. And a lot of people don't sit well like that. But we're far from the isolationists that we were in the early 1900s. We're strong. We want to be a power player in the world today. We want to keep ourselves up there at the top. We do this by working together with other countries. What you're seeing here is, what's that chart right there? NAFTA. One of the things we just talked about earlier was that there was some controversy regarding NAFTA. That right there is a trade deficit between the United States and Mexico. So we import about, according to that, what is it, $70 billion more dollars worth of stuff than we export into Mexico. So it's not really fair, according to Donald Trump, for the United States to give them more in that deal than they're giving to us. So he wants to kind of balance that out. And there it is again, the same chart. In the in the European Union, the big thing that you've been hearing about for the last 2 years is Brexit. Oh, blimey, right? Maybe that's, I don't know if they say that or not, to be honest. All right, so in the United Kingdom, right now, they're trying to figure out or negotiate how they're going to exit. You see, they voted already in 2016 under David Cameron. Hey, we want to Brexit. We want to break up and divorce the European Union because largely they want to be able to make better trade deals. But I think one of the biggest issues here, one of the big issues is migration. You got this Syrian civil war, and you got a bunch of other immigrants from countries in Northern Africa or even other parts of Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, that are culturally and religiously different from Europeans. And there's this massive influx from across the Mediterranean of these people trying to come in and seek refuge in Europe. And Europeans, they're tired of that. So we think that we have a big immigration problem with building a wall down the southern border of Mexico, but it's kind of the same in Europe in a lot of ways, maybe even worse because the cultural differences are way different. So conservatives in Europe are really tired of taking in refugees. And this is kind of across the board. And you see this just like Donald Trump represents kind of a conservative wave across U.S. politics regarding these very same issues. You kind of had that or kind of have that movement in Europe as well. So the United Kingdom wants to be able to better control who comes in their country. They can't do that under the European Union, and so they wanted to break off, be able to handle their own border. This right here is a chart that shows the countries that pay more into the European Union than they receive. The United Kingdom is right up there in the middle of that. All right, these are the richest countries in the European Union. They give more to the collective whole than they get. Could you imagine how President Trump would feel if we were part of the European Union and we were paying in to support places like Hungary and Bulgaria that receive the majority of the money? So that right there is the reason for the European Brexit, because they want to have sovereignty over their borders and over their trade deals and over their economy. So pay attention to that. They're supposed to have an agreement on how they Brexit. As early as March of this year, we're going to find out if they're going to either have a soft Brexit, a hard Brexit, or if they're going to just let it go by the wayside, not figure out a solution, and just figure out what happens as it does. I imagine that's probably not the choice that most of them want to follow. So stay tuned to that. And that right there wraps us up for today on supranationalism. I want to end by showing you guys these video links. You've got the United Nations. Those first two up there are about that. The second one there is a quick video about the WTO. The OPEC video here is from CBS or something like that. I think it's like a 3 or 4 minute video. Very, very good. Add something else up here too. One of these United Nations one is the one I was telling you about. I think this one here, the first one, was the one that had to do with P5. So definitely go in and give that a watch before your test so that you'll know about those people. Summary, we talked about supranational organizations beginning as early as the 1900s with the League of Nations. We talked about the fact that they existed for both militarily and today predominantly economic reasons, and how these things put sovereignty into question. Are there any questions about any of this stuff we talked about today? If you need anything, find me on Twitter or YouTube, or go to my Facebook page. Let me know what I can do for you guys. That's it. I'll see you guys next Thursday night. Peace.